After 10 years of living in my house, my son and his wife inherited $5 million from my dead wife's secret trust. The next Sunday, while I was sitting in the third pew at church, they changed every lock on my home and my lighthouse. When I came back, my own key did not fit. My son's voice came through the door. "Find somewhere else, old man." I did not shout. I stood in the yard, listened to the waves behind me, and smiled. "Son, do you know whose name your mother carved into that lighthouse door?" His face changed. Not all at once. It was like watching a crack spread through the glass of a lantern room, slow and splintering and impossible to stop once it starts. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. But nothing came out. Not a word. Not a sound. Just the wind off Cobscook Bay, filling the silence between us, the way cold water fills a hull when the seal breaks. But I am getting ahead of myself. You do not know me yet. Let me fix that. Welcome to this story. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories about family, justice, and standing your ground, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and drop a like so we know you are here. Quick reminder, this narrative includes dramatized elements for storytelling and educational value. Any resemblance to actual persons or situations is purely coincidental, but the lesson behind it, that is what truly matters. My name is Russell Hale. I am 73 years old. For 36 years, I served in the United States Coast Guard, stationed along the down-east coast of Maine from Penobscot Bay to the Canadian border. I piloted rescue cutters through winter storms that turned the Atlantic into a washing machine of gray water and wind. I pulled lobstermen out of capsized boats at 3 a.m. with ice on my gloves and salt in my eyes. I logged coordinates, weather readings, and crew reports every single day for 36 years, without missing a single entry. Because when you are responsible for lives on the water, documentation is not a habit. It is a discipline. And discipline is the only thing standing between a safe crew and a body recovery. I retired in 2014 with a pension of $2,100 a month, a commendation certificate from the Commandant of the Coast Guard, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every man and woman I was ever ordered to find came home alive. Every single one. I do not say that with pride. I say it with precision. There is a difference. Pride is a feeling. Precision is a record. And my record is clean. I live at 47 Gull Point Road, Lubec, Maine. If you have never heard of Lubec, that is because most people have not. It is the easternmost town in the United States, population 1,300 on a good year. The kind of place where the post office closes at noon on Saturdays and the grocery store knows your name and your blood pressure. 6 acres of rocky shoreline backed up against the spruce tree line, with Cobscook Bay stretching out to the east, and the dark shape of Campobello Island sitting on the horizon like a promise someone made a long time ago and never quite kept. Margaret and I bought the land in 1983 for $14,000. The house came later, but the lighthouse was already there. An old one, decommissioned in 1971, stone foundation, brick tower, a lantern room with cracked glass and a rusted iron railing. The Coast Guard had abandoned it. The town had forgotten it. But the first time Margaret stood at its base and looked up at the tower against the October sky, she put her hand on the stone and said, "Every good home needs something that will outlive its owners." She was not talking about the house. I bought the lighthouse from the federal government for $600 through a surplus property auction. That was 1984. I was 29 years old. Margaret was 27. We had a savings account with $11,000 in it, a pickup truck with 140,000 miles on the odometer, and a belief that was either faith or stupidity that 2 people with strong backs and a clear plan could turn an abandoned lighthouse and a patch of Maine coastline into something worth building a life around. We were right. It took 26 years. 26 years of weekends, holidays, shore leave, And every spare hour I could carve out between Coast Guard deployments. I rebuilt that lighthouse with my own hands. Brick by brick, pane by pane, railing by railing. I repointed the mortar. I replaced every piece of glass in the lantern room. I sanded the iron railing until it was smooth enough to run your palm along without catching skin. I installed a light, not the original Fresnel lens, but a modern beacon I salvaged from a decommissioned Coast Guard station in Jonesport. It was not as powerful as the original, but it worked. And on the night I first switched it on, the beam swept across the water in a slow, steady arc, and Margaret stood beside me in the lantern room and did not say a word. She just watched the light touch the waves. That lighthouse was never a decoration. It was a logbook. Every brick I reset was a year. Every pane of glass I replaced was a storm we survived. And on the day we finished, Margaret took a chisel and carved something into the wooden frame of the lighthouse door. I can see it in my mind right now, even from here. Even after everything. Russell and Margaret, 1983. As long as this light stands, we stand. I am not a wealthy man. I have never been a wealthy man. But I am a precise one. 36 years on the water will do that. To a person. You learn to check your charts twice. Log everything. And never trust a current you have not read yourself. I did not know it then. But I was describing a life that was about to be tested by the one force no chart can predict and no compass can navigate. The people you love, Margaret Ann Hale. Maggie, to everyone who knew her longer than 5 minutes. She was 5'4" with reading glasses that never stayed on her nose, and a voice so quiet that people leaned in when she spoke, which meant she never had to raise it. She was a librarian, head librarian at the Lubeck Memorial Library for 30 years. From 1984 until the spring she died. She cataloged every book that came through those doors. She memorized the borrowing habits of half the town. She knew that Angus MacBride checked out the same Patrick O'Brian novel every February and returned it in March with salt stains on the cover, and she never once charged him a late fee because she understood that some men read the same book every winter the way other men visit a grave. It is not about the story. It is about the return. She was the kind of woman who remembered what mattered. She remembered that the Pelletier boy in the 4th grade could not afford new books, so she quietly set aside donations and told him they were extras. She remembered that old Eunice Gagnon came to the library every Thursday not to read but to sit in a warm room, and Maggie always made sure the chair by the window was open. She remembered things the way I logged weather readings, precisely, faithfully, and with the understanding that what you record today may be the only evidence that it ever happened at all. We met in 1981 at a Coast Guard open house in Eastport. I was 26, standing next to a 44-foot motor lifeboat, explaining rescue protocols to school children more interested in the boat's horn than anything I had to say. Maggie was chaperoning. She stood at the back with her arms crossed and a look I would come to know well over the next 34 years. The look of a woman deciding in real time whether you were worth her attention. I must have passed, because when the children ran off, she walked up to me and said, "You explain things like you actually care whether people understand them. That is rare." I asked her to coffee. She said yes. I never recovered. We married in 1983 at the Congregational Church in Lubeck. The same church I still attend every Sunday. The same third pew. Maggie wore her mother's dress. I wore my dress blues. 22 people attended. Angus MacBride was my best man. He gave a toast that lasted 45 seconds because Angus believed that anything worth saying could be said in under a minute, and anything longer was either a lecture or a lie. We had 2 children. Troy Russell Hale, born in 1987, and Ada Margaret Hale, born in 1994. Troy was our firstborn, broad-shouldered even as a baby, with a cry that could cut through a nor'easter. He grew into a restless boy and a more restless young man. He played football at Lubeck High, good enough to start but never good enough to be recruited. He took that personally. He took most things personally. Troy saw the world as a series of transactions. What he gave, what he got, and whether the ledger balanced. Maggie worried about that. She said once on the porch with her tea, "That boy counts everything except the things that count." I did not understand her then. I understand her now. Ada was different. She came into the world 7 weeks early, 4 pounds and 11 ounces. She spent her first 3 weeks in a neonatal unit in Bangor. And Maggie drove 2 hours each way every day without missing one. When we brought Ada home, Maggie held her in the rocking chair by the kitchen window and whispered, "You are worth every mile." Ada grew up quiet and watchful. She had her mother's eyes, the kind that saw what people tried to hide. She drew pictures of the lighthouse before she could write her own name. By 12, she could identify every bird along the Cobscook shoreline by its call. She was Maggie's daughter in every way that mattered. Our life was not extraordinary. I want to be honest about that. We did not travel the world or accumulate wealth, but we built something. Every morning, I woke at 5:15. I made coffee. Black. The same way since boot camp in 1978. I carried 2 mugs to the porch. Maggie joined me by 5:45. Wrapped in her grandmother's quilt, reading glasses on, a book already open. She read on that porch every morning for 31 years. Poetry in spring, novels in summer, history in autumn, theology in winter. She said the seasons told her what to read. In the evenings, we watched the lighthouse beam sweep across the water. I had calibrated it to a 12-second cycle. Every 12 seconds, the light touched the rocks, then the bay, then the dark shoreline of Campobello, then back again. Maggie said it was like a heartbeat. I said it was like a watch hand. She said that was the most romantic thing I had ever said, and I still do not know if she was joking. The lighthouse was our clock, our calendar, our witness. When Troy took his first steps, we were standing in the tower's shadow. When Ada said her first word, book naturally, the light was sweeping across the kitchen window. When Maggie and I sat on the porch on New Year's Eve of 1999 and watched the century turn, the beam was the only other thing awake with us. I maintained that lighthouse every single day. I logged every inspection in a hardbound notebook. Date, weather, light mechanism, glass condition, mortar state, repairs, 10 years of daily entries. 3,652 logs in my own hand. No agency required it. The lighthouse was decommissioned. I did it because that is what a keeper does. You keep the light whether anyone is watching or not. Maggie never asked why I climbed those stairs every morning. She simply left a thermos of coffee at the base of the tower on cold mornings. And when I came back down, she was already reading on the porch. That was our language. Not words. Presence. The quiet act of being exactly where someone needs you to be without being asked. I did not know it then, but I was describing a life that someone in my own blood would try to dismantle, not with a storm or a wave, but with patience and paperwork and the slow, deliberate theft of everything I had ever anchored myself to. Margaret Hale died on a Tuesday in April of 2017. The way the sea takes everything it wants, without warning and without apology. She had gone kayaking on Cobscook Bay that morning. She did it every spring, the first warm week after the ice broke. It was her ritual, the way my morning inspections were mine. She would paddle out past the rocks below Gull Point, follow the shoreline east toward Quoddy Head, and return in time for lunch. She had done it every April for 19 years. She knew the tides. She knew the currents. She knew the bay, the way I knew the inside of a rescue cutter. By feel, by instinct, by a kind of trust that only comes from decades of repetition. The storm came from the northeast, a late-season squall that was not in any forecast. The National Weather Service issued a warning at 9:42 in the morning. Maggie had launched at 8:30. By the time the wind hit the bay, she was 2 miles offshore with no line of sight to the harbor. The water temperature was 41 degrees, The Coast Guard station in Eastport received the distress call at 10:15. They launched a 47-foot motor lifeboat within 9 minutes. I know because I called the station afterward and asked for the log. 9 minutes. My former crew. My former boat. They found the kayak overturned, near Johnson Cove, at 10:51. They found Maggie at 11:03. Hypothermia and drowning. She was 64 years old. The officer who came to my door that afternoon was a young woman, a lieutenant I had trained 6 years earlier during her first deployment out of Eastport. She stood on my porch in her dress uniform, and she held her cover in both hands, and she could not look at me. I knew before she spoke. You always know. The body understands before the mind does. Your hands go cold. Your chest tightens, and somewhere in the back of your skull, a door closes that will never open again. I spent 36 years pulling people out of the water. I saved every single person I was ever ordered to find. Everyone. And the one person I could not save was the woman who left a thermos of coffee at the base of my lighthouse every cold morning for 31 years. The sea does not care about your record. It does not read your commendations. It takes what it wants when it wants, and it does not negotiate. The house did not change after she died. That was the cruelest part. The walls stayed where they were. The kitchen window still looked out at the bay. The lighthouse still stood on the bluff, its beam still sweeping the water every 12 seconds the way I had calibrated it. But the silence. Let me tell you something about grief that no one prepares you for. It does not empty a house. It fills it. It fills it with a silence so dense you can hear the furnace cycling in the basement, the clock ticking in a room you are not standing in, the floorboards settling under the weight of no one at all. Her reading glasses sat on the small table beside the porch chair for 2 weeks before I could bring myself to move them. I did not move them far. I placed them in the top drawer of the bureau in our bedroom, next to a bookmark and a pen with the cap, chewed the way she always chewed them. I closed the drawer. I did not open it again for 4 months. The bed was the hardest part. Not sleeping in it. Sleeping in half of it. My side stayed warm. Her side was cold every morning, and every morning I reached across and felt the cool sheet and had to learn all over again that she was gone. A man can know something with his mind and still have to relearn it with his hand every single day. There is a term in navigation called dead reckoning. It is the process of calculating your current position based solely on a previously known position, your speed, your heading, and the time elapsed. No landmarks, no GPS, no stars. Just math and memory and the faith that the numbers will lead you somewhere solid. That is what grief felt like. Dead reckoning through fog so thick I could not see the bow of my own life. But I kept the light on. Every morning I climbed the lighthouse stairs. Every morning I inspected the glass, checked the mechanism, logged the entry in my notebook. Date, weather, condition, repairs. The routine did not heal me. Routine does not heal anything. But it held me in place the way an anchor holds a vessel in a current. Not by stopping the force, but by giving you something to pull against so the drift does not carry you out to open water where there is nothing to hold on to at all. I talked to the lighthouse more than I care to admit. Not to Maggie exactly. To the structure. To the stone and the glass and the light that swept the water in her absence, the same way it had swept it in her presence. I told it about the weather. I told it when the mortar needed repointing. I told it things I could not say to anyone living, because the living expect a response, and the lighthouse just listened. Her photograph sat on the mantel above the fireplace, the one from our 30th anniversary. She was holding my hand and squinting into the August sun, and there was a look on her face I have never been able to describe. Not quite a smile. The expression of a woman who had decided 30 years earlier that she was exactly where she wanted to be and had never revised that opinion. I drank my coffee every morning looking at that photograph. I never got tired of it. Frank Ballard. That is what I almost called him. His name is Angus. Angus McBride. My neighbor to the west. He checked on me every few days. We sat on the porch and drank coffee, and talked about tides and lobster prices and the patch of erosion along the bluff that needed attention. Angus never asked me how I was feeling. He knew better. He just showed up. That is what good men do. I managed. I want to be clear about that. I was 70 years old. I had 2 working hands, a clear mind, and a lighthouse that needed keeping. I cooked my own meals. I maintained my property. I filed my own taxes. I kept Maggie's garden in the spring. Tomatoes along the south fence and marigolds bordering the walkway. Because she believed marigolds kept the deer away, and I was not about to argue with a dead woman I still loved. 3 months. That is how long I had my house to myself before I gave it away. Willingly, lovingly, foolishly. I had my pension. I had my garden. I had Angus next door, and enough sense to know that being alone is not the same as being helpless. Then my son called. "Dad," he said. His voice was thin, the kind of thin that comes from a man who has practiced sounding desperate. "Dad, we are in trouble." And I did what every father does. I said, "Come home." They arrived on a Saturday in July. I had spent 2 days preparing. I aired out the guest room at the end of the hall, the one with the window that looked out over the bay. I put fresh sheets on the bed. I stocked the refrigerator with more food than I had bought in 3 months. I brewed a pot of coffee and set 3 mugs on the counter. And for a moment, standing in that kitchen with 3 mugs instead of 1, I almost felt like the house was breathing again. Troy called on a Wednesday evening. His voice had a particular thinness to it, the kind that comes not from emotion, but from rehearsal. A man who has practiced sounding desperate sounds different from a man who actually is. I did not notice the difference then. I notice it now. Replaying that call in my mind the way I used to replay weather logs after a close rescue, looking for the signal I missed. He told me his insurance brokerage license had been revoked. He said the market turned against him. He said the regulatory board overreacted. He did not use the word fraud. I learned that word later. From a public record filing in Penobscot County that described how Troy Russell Hale had falsified client policy documents to inflate commissions over a period of 14 months. He did not tell me that part. He told me the version where the world was unfair and he was the victim. Kristen had lost her position at a law firm in Bangor, where she had worked as a paralegal for 3 years. Troy said she was let go due to downsizing. I never confirmed whether that was true. They had been evicted from their apartment on Union Street. The landlord had taped the notice to their door. Troy described it as a misunderstanding. That is the word he used. Misunderstanding. As though 14 months of forged documents and an eviction notice were simply a failure of communication. I did not ask questions. I said, "Come home." That is what fathers do. And that is exactly what people who want something from you count on. Their truck pulled into the gravel driveway at 11:30 on a Saturday morning. Colleen stepped out first. I almost wrote that. I do not have a daughter named Colleen. My daughter's name is Ada. And she was not in that truck. She was in Bar Harbor, 200 miles south, and she did not know her brother was moving into our father's house. Troy had not told her. I would learn why later. Troy stepped out of the driver's side. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered and square-jawed, wearing a polo shirt and sunglasses that looked new. He did not look at me. He did not look at the house. He looked at the lighthouse. His eyes moved from the tower to the bluff, to the shoreline, to the tree line, and back again, slowly. The way a man looks at something he is calculating, not admiring, measuring. His first words to me were not "thank you." They were not, "I appreciate this," or "this is generous of you." His first words, standing on my gravel driveway next to my house in front of the lighthouse I had rebuilt with my own hands, were these. "Does this property include the lighthouse legally? Like, is it part of the deed? Or is it separate?" "Yes," I said. "It is all one parcel." He nodded. Slow. The way a man nods when he is filing information away for later. I should have heard what he was really asking. I did not. I heard. A son. Making conversation. A father's love is a kind of deafness. You hear what you need to hear to keep believing the best about the people you raised. Kristen came around from the passenger side. She was 26, thin, with sharp features, and the kind of posture that belongs to someone who is always watching and never quite relaxing. She had blonde hair pulled back tight and eyes that moved across the property with the same measuring quality as Troy's, except hers were faster. She scanned the house, the porch, the lighthouse, the acreage, the bay, all of it in under 10 seconds. And then she smiled at me. It was a pleasant smile. It reached her mouth but not her eyes. "Nice property," she said. "Really nice location." "Thank you," I said. She said it again 10 minutes later when I showed them the kitchen. "Nice space. Really well maintained." 2 compliments about the property. 0 about the meal I had prepared. 0 about the generosity. I counted. A captain counts everything. Supplies, headings, weather readings, the number of seconds between a distress signal and a response. And when the numbers do not add up, you are supposed to ask why. I did not ask why. I showed them to the guest room. Troy carried 2 suitcases upstairs without asking which room. He chose the one at the end of the hall, the largest, the one with the view of the full 6 acres and the lighthouse in the bay beyond. I noticed. I told myself it did not mean anything. That first evening I cooked for 3. Clam chowder the way Maggie used to make it, with potatoes from the garden and cream from the dairy in Whiting. I set the table with 3 bowls, 3 spoons, 3 glasses of water. The kitchen smelled like butter and salt and something I had almost forgotten. Company. Troy ate fast. The way a man eats when he is already thinking about something else. He did not compliment the chowder. He complimented the house again. "Good bones," he said, looking at the ceiling beams. "Solide construction. These old places are worth more than people think." 3 compliments about the property in one afternoon. 0 about the meal. 0 about the fact that his 70-year-old father had spent 2 days preparing for his arrival. I counted because that is what captains do. We count. We log. And when the readings are off, we note the discrepancy and we watch. I did not watch closely enough. I cleared the bowls and brewed more coffee and told myself that my son was home and that was all that mattered. 10 years. That is how long a few months turned out to be. 10 years of Troy Hale in my house, eating my food, sleeping under my roof. And slowly, so slowly, I almost did not notice, pulling the boards out from under my feet one by one until the deck I was standing on no longer held. That was my first mistake. Not loving my son. That was never a mistake. The mistake was hearing "Does this property include the lighthouse?" and thinking it was curiosity when what it really was, I would learn, was reconnaissance. The changes came the way fog rolls into Cobscook Bay. So slow you do not notice until you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. The first 2 years, I convinced myself the arrangement could work. Troy helped around the property. He patched a section of the roof where the winter ice had buckled the shingles. He cleared snow from the driveway after the January storms, heavy work that my 70-year-old back was grateful to surrender. He replaced a gutter bracket that had been pulling away from the eave since the previous autumn. Small repairs, visible ones, the kind of work a man does when he wants to be seen doing it. Kristen cooked on Sundays, pot roast or pasta or sometimes a casserole that was competent but never warm. The 3 of us sat at the kitchen table and ate together, and I told myself this was what the house needed. Sound, movement, the scrape of chairs and the clatter of plates and the particular noise that a home makes when more than one person is breathing inside it. I told myself I needed it too, and maybe I did. But I had been a captain for 36 years, and captains are trained to notice when the heading shifts, even when the wheel looks steady. The books moved first. Maggie's books. She had kept 3 shelves in the living room organized by season, the way she organized her reading life. Poetry on the top shelf, novels in the middle, history and theology on the bottom. She had arranged them herself, spines aligned, each one placed with the care of a woman who believed that how you kept your books said something about how you kept your mind. One Tuesday in November of the first year, I walked into the living room, and the top shelf was empty. Troy had moved the poetry books to a box in the garage. "They are just collecting dust, Dad," he said. His voice was casual, the voice of a man doing you a favor. I moved them back. 2 weeks later, the middle shelf was empty. This time, the novels were in a plastic bin in the basement. "More room this way," he said. I moved them back. The third time, I found Maggie's copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass in a box marked for donation sitting by the front door. The book had her handwriting in the margins. 30 years of notes in blue ink, her thoughts pressed into the pages like flowers pressed between the leaves of a heavy book. I held it in both hands, and I felt something tighten in my chest that I had not felt since the morning the Coast Guard called to tell me they had found her. I did not say anything to Troy. I put the book back on the shelf. I photographed its position with my phone. Date, time, location. Old habit. Captains document everything. Then the photograph moved. Maggie's anniversary portrait on the mantel above the fireplace. The one from our 30th. I came downstairs one morning, and it was on the hallway shelf behind a stack of Troy's magazines. I moved it back. A month later, it was in the kitchen drawer face down beneath a pile of takeout menus. "Better light in the kitchen," Troy said when I asked. I moved it back. I photographed each position. The mantel, the hallway, the drawer. I did not know yet that those photographs would become evidence. "It is just a picture, Dad," Kristen said one evening when she saw me replacing it on the mantel. She said it gently. "The way you speak to someone you believe is being unreasonable." And maybe I was. Maybe a photograph on a mantel is a small thing, but it was not a small thing to me. It was the last place Maggie looked out from every morning when I drank my coffee. And a man who could not remember to say thank you was putting her face in a drawer. Then came the property taxes. End of the first year, November 2017. Troy sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Let me handle the taxes this year. Least I can do." His voice was easy, casual, the voice of a man offering to do the dishes. I should have said no. I should have said that I had paid my own property taxes for 31 years, and I did not intend to stop. Instead, I said, "That is kind of you." And he smiled. And he paid them in his own name. He did it again the second year. Same tone, same smile, same result. Troy Hale listed as the taxpayer on the property records for 47 Gull Point Road, Lubec, Maine. 2 consecutive years. I kept the receipts. I did not know why at the time. Call it instinct. Call it 36 years of never signing off on a navigation chart without verifying the coordinates first. Have you ever watched someone dismantle your life so gradually that each individual piece seems too small to fight over? That is the mathematics of it. No single thing Troy did was worth a confrontation. A book here, a photograph there, a tax receipt filed under the wrong name. Each one, a degree, off course. And in open water, 1 degree of error over 1,000 miles puts you so far from your destination that you cannot see land in any direction. That autumn, Angus McBride came by for coffee. Angus lived on the 4 acres directly west of mine, a man of 80 years by then, a retired lobsterman who had pulled traps out of Cobscook Bay for 50 years, who drove a truck older than most of his neighbors, and who had exactly 0 patience for what he called people who smile while they measure your hull for holes. Angus sat on my porch and looked through the kitchen window at the rearranged living room and said nothing for a long time. He picked up his coffee. He set it down. He picked it up again. Then he asked me a question that shifted the current of everything. "Russell, who has been paying your property taxes?" I told him. His face hardened. Not anger. Something worse. Recognition. Maine law, Angus said. 20 years continuous for standard adverse possession. but combine tax payments in another name with physical occupation, documented maintenance, and any kind of legal filing. And a man with a good lawyer can make a claim in less than half that time. He looked at me. He is not settling in, Russell. He is moving you out. One tax payment at a time. I stared at him. I could feel my hand tighten around the porch railing, the same railing I had sanded and sealed the summer Maggie was pregnant with Ada. 2 years of property taxes in his name. 2 years. I lay in bed that night and ran the numbers the way I used to calculate tidal currents. Precise, cold, and with the growing certainty that the water was rising faster than I had estimated. There are things a man can forgive. A moved photograph, a rearranged shelf, even a name on a tax receipt that is not yours. You tell yourself it is family. You tell yourself people make mistakes. You tell yourself that the son you raised, the boy who took his first steps in the shadow of your lighthouse, could not possibly be doing what the numbers suggest he is doing. And for a while, the telling works. It holds you together, the way caulk holds a seam. Not permanently, just long enough to get through the next wave. Year 3 is when the caulk failed. Troy did not announce the change. There was no confrontation, no line drawn in the kitchen. He simply stopped performing the version of himself that had made the first 2 years bearable. The helpful son who patched the roof and cleared the driveway vanished overnight, and in his place was the man who had been there all along, standing behind the performance like a shadow waiting for the light to shift. He took over the living room. Not by asking, not by discussing, but by filling it. His laptop on the coffee table, his papers across the couch, his jacket draped over the back of Maggie's reading chair. The chair where she had sat every evening for 31 years with a book in her lap and her glasses sliding down her nose. Troy's jacket hung from its arm like a flag planted in conquered territory. One evening I was watching the news and he appeared in the doorway. "I need this room," he said. "I have a call." Not a question. A statement. I got up and went to my bedroom because it was easier than arguing. And I told myself it was just one evening. It was not just one evening. He stopped knocking before entering my room. He would open the door at 6:30 in the morning and say something about the water heater or the thermostat or the garbage schedule. And I would be sitting on the edge of my bed in my undershirt and he would not pause. He would not apologize. He spoke to me the way you speak, to a piece of furniture that is in your path. Something to be moved, not addressed. There is a term in maritime engineering called creep. It describes what happens when a material under constant stress slowly deforms over time. Not suddenly, not visibly. A millimeter here, a fraction there, a gradual bending under sustained pressure that you cannot detect until the structure fails. That is what Troy did to the shape of my days. He deformed them so slowly that I did not realize the house was no longer mine until I found myself asking permission to use my own kitchen in the morning. "You left the stove on again, Russell," he said one Tuesday. His voice was slow and over-enunciated. The voice people use when they are speaking to someone they believe is losing their mind. I had not left the stove on. I had not used the stove that day, but Kristen was standing in the hallway, and she heard him say it. And she looked at me with something that might have been concern. And I understood then what he was building. He was not just rearranging my house. He was constructing a narrative. The narrative of an old man who could not take care of himself. The following month, he spoke to Dr. Callahan at the Lubeck Community Health Center. I know this because Callahan told me later, after everything fell apart. Troy had called the office and expressed concern about his father's cognitive health. He described episodes of confusion, repeated stories, a stove left on. Callahan listened and took notes, because that is what doctors do. But Callahan had known me for 22 years. He had treated my blood pressure and my arthritic knee, and the shoulder I dislocated hauling a lobsterman out of the water in 2008. He knew me, and he told me later, quietly, over coffee at Angus's kitchen table, that something about Troy's call had not felt right. "I filed it," Callahan said, "but I did not believe it. Troy paid the property taxes again. Year 3. Year 4. Each time with the same casual offer. Each time in his own name. I kept the receipts. I kept every receipt the way. I kept every navigation log. Precise. Dated. Filed. He cut the internet in the autumn of year 3. He called the provider and downgraded the plan to a single device. His device. You do not use it anyway, Dad, he said. And he was mostly right. I did not use the internet for entertainment or news. I used it to email Ada. That was the only connection I had left to my daughter. And he severed it with a phone call and a smile. Then one morning in October of 2021, I walked to the lighthouse for my daily inspection. The path from the house to the tower is 212 steps. I have counted them more times than I can remember. That morning I counted them the same way I always did. But when I reached the door, my hand found a lock I did not recognize. Bright brass, new. The kind you purchase at the hardware store in Machias. My key did not fit. I stood there for a long time. The wind came off the bay sharp and cold, carrying the smell of salt and rockweed and the low-tide flats south of Quoddy Head. I could hear the gulls. I could hear the water against the rocks below the bluff. I could hear everything except the sound of my own lighthouse door opening. And then I looked at the frame. The wooden frame of the lighthouse door, where Maggie had carved our names 38 years ago, where she had pressed a chisel into the grain and written the words that were supposed to outlive us both. I looked at the frame, and I saw white paint. Fresh, clean, deliberate. A single coat of exterior latex, still tacky at the edges, applied with a roller in smooth, even strokes. He had painted over the inscription, Russell and Margaret, 1983. As long as this light stands, we stand. Gone. Not destroyed. Covered. Hidden beneath a layer of white paint so thin I could almost see the letters underneath if I pressed my face close enough to the wood. But from any normal distance, the frame was blank. As though no one had ever carved anything there at all. As though Maggie had never stood in that doorway with a chisel in her hand and told me that every good home needs something that will outlive its owners. I pressed my palm against the painted wood. It was cold and smooth, and it smelled like chemicals and erasure. And I stood there in the October wind with my hand on the door of my own lighthouse that I could no longer enter, touching the place where my wife's name used to be visible to anyone who cared to look, and I understood something that I had been refusing to understand for 3 years. This was not carelessness. This was not a sun settling in. This was demolition. Slow, patient, methodical demolition of everything I had built and everything Maggie had left behind. And the man doing it was sleeping in the largest bedroom of my house with a view of the lighthouse he had just locked me out of. I stood at that lighthouse door for a long time after I found the paint. The wind came off the water in gusts that pressed my jacket flat against my chest, and the gulls screamed overhead, and I did not move. I pressed my fingers against the wood where the letters used to be, and I felt them. Not with my eyes. With my hands. The ridges of the carving were still there beneath the latex, faint but present. The way a scar remains under new skin. The chisel marks Maggie had made 38 years ago had not been sanded. They had not been filled. They had been covered. There is a difference between something that is destroyed and something that is hidden. I knew this from 36 years of inspecting structures in salt air and storm damage. Destruction is irreversible. A cracked foundation, a collapsed beam, a hull breached below the waterline. Those things cannot be undone. But concealment is different. Concealment is paint over rot, a tarp over a hole, a smile over a plan. And concealment, unlike destruction, can be reversed. All it requires is the right tool, the right pressure, and the willingness to look at what someone tried to make you forget was there. Maggie's name was still carved into that door. Troy had hidden it. He had not erased it. And that knowledge, small as it was the first solid thing I had stood on in 3 years. I went inside that afternoon and picked up the telephone to call Ada. I had not spoken to my daughter in over a year. The last time I had tried, the line went to voicemail, and the mailbox was full. I had written 3 letters to her apartment in Bar Harbor. None of them were returned. None of them were answered. I told myself, she was busy. She was 32 years old, working as a wildlife photographer along the coast, building a career and a life of her own. Young people get busy. They forget. They do not mean anything by the silence. I dialed her number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I hung up and dialed again. Same result. I tried a 3rd time. Nothing. I set the phone down and stared at it on the kitchen counter, and felt the particular helplessness of a man who cannot reach his own child and does not understand why. The next morning I walked to Angus's house. He was on his porch repairing a lobster trap, his hands moving through the wire mesh with the automatic precision of a man who has performed the same motion 10,000 times. I asked him to call Ada. I told him my calls were not going through, and I did not know if there was a problem with the line or with something else. Angus set down the trap. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he went inside and dialed. Ada picked up on the 2nd ring. Angus came back out 11 minutes later. His face was different. Not angry. Not sad. Something between the two that I had never seen on a man whose expressions I had memorized over 30 years of friendship. He sat down heavily in his porch chair and he told me. Troy had called Ada in the spring of 2020. He told her that I was showing signs of cognitive decline. He told her I was becoming confused, forgetful, and increasingly agitated. He told her that the doctors were concerned. He told her that the best thing for my well-being was to give me space, that phone calls upset me, that letters confused me, that contact from family members was making the situation worse. He told her I did not want to talk to her. Ada had believed him. She had believed her own brother when he told her that her father did not want to hear her voice, and she had spent 2 years honoring a wish I had never made, grieving a version of me that did not exist, because the man sleeping in my guest room had decided that my daughter was a liability to his plan and had cut the line between us with a single phone call and a handful of lies. Angus said Ada had cried. He said she had asked if I was all right, if I still knew who she was, if I still remembered her name. Those questions. From my daughter. About me. Whether I remembered her name. I sat on Angus's porch, and I gripped the armrest of his chair, and I did not trust myself to speak for a very long time. The bay stretched out below us, flat and gray and indifferent. The lighthouse stood on the bluff to the east, locked, painted over, silent. And somewhere in Bar Harbor, my daughter was crying because she thought her father had forgotten her. Russell, Angus said. His voice was the quietest I had ever heard it. Your boy has been cutting the lines. No internet, no phone to your daughter, no key to your own lighthouse. This is not carelessness. This is not a man settling in. This is a siege. And sieges only end one of 2 ways. Either the wall falls or someone breaks through it. I nodded. I could not speak yet, but I nodded. A year passed. The siege continued. Troy paid the property taxes again. Year 5. I kept the receipt. He moved freely through the house as though it were already his. He spoke to Kristen in the hallway about renovation plans I was clearly meant to overhear. New kitchen. Open the back wall. Maybe add a deck with a view of the water. They discussed my home the way architects discuss a building they have been hired to redesign. The current owner was not part of the conversation. Then came the evening in the autumn of 2022 that I have replayed more times than any other. We were sitting at the kitchen table. I had made chowder. Troy set down his spoon, leaned back, and looked at me with the slow, measured gaze he had perfected over 5 years of living in my house. 10 years is a long time, Russell, he said. The law has a funny way of recognizing the people who actually take care of a place. I looked at him. He did not say your house. He said a place. And a man who replaces your with a has already decided in his own mind whose name belongs on the deed. I set my spoon down. I looked at the man sitting across from me in my kitchen, the kitchen I had built with Maggie in 1984, and I felt something shift inside my chest that I had been holding back for years. Not anger, something colder, the recognition that my son had just told me to my face that he intended to take my home. And he was smiling while he said it. "You will not even see it coming, old man," he said on his way out of the kitchen. He said it without turning around. The way you say something that is not a threat, because you believe the outcome is already decided. I sat alone at that table for a long time. The lighthouse was dark on the bluff outside the window. The bay was black. And I understood with the clarity of a man who has spent his entire life reading instruments that every gauge in my life was now pointing in the same direction. Toward a storm I could no longer pretend was not coming. The most dangerous discovery Troy ever made was not in my house. It was in a building his mother had loved more than almost anywhere else on earth. The Lubeck Memorial Library sits on Water Street, 3 blocks from the harbor. In a white clapboard building with green shutters, and a reading room that smells like old paper and radiator heat. Maggie had run that library for 30 years. She had organized its shelves, repaired its bindings, written its grant applications, and kept its doors open through 2 budget crises and a nor'easter that took out half the roof in 2009. She rebuilt the roof herself that year, or rather, she organized the volunteers who rebuilt it, which in Lubeck amounts to the same thing. When Maggie died, the library held a memorial in the reading room. They placed her photograph on the front desk beside a vase of wildflowers and a card that read, "She gave us every book and kept the best stories to herself." I attended. I sat in the back row and I did not cry because there were too many people watching, and I am not a man who performs his grief. But I touched the spine of every book on the shelf nearest my chair, because her hands had touched them first, and that was enough. Maggie had kept certain personal documents at the library. Not in the public collection, but in a locked filing cabinet in the back office that she had used for 30 years. Library business, mostly. Grant records, correspondence, budget files, but also, I would learn, personal papers she did not want anyone at home to find. She had a key. After she died, the new librarian, Ellen Park, kept the cabinet locked out of respect. No one opened it. No one except Troy. I do not know exactly when he accessed the cabinet. I do not know whether he picked the lock or found a spare key, or simply asked Ellen with the easy smile he used when he wanted something and did not want the asking to feel like asking. What I know is this. In the autumn of 2023, Troy Hale sat in the back office of the Lubeck Memorial Library and opened a filing cabinet that had been his mother's. And inside it he found a document that changed everything. It was a trust. A revocable living trust, established by Margaret Ann Hale in 2002, 15 years before her death. The trust was funded by a life insurance policy that Maggie had maintained for 35 years, paying the premiums monthly from her librarian's salary. 35 years of quiet deposits, small amounts, $40 a month in the early years, gradually increasing as her salary grew. By the time she died, the policy had accumulated a death benefit and cash value totaling $5 million. $5 million. From a woman who earned less than $40,000 a year for most of her career. From a woman who packed her lunch every day and drove a 12-year-old sedan and never once mentioned to me that she was building something this large in the background of our life. $5 million assembled 1 month at a time over 35 years, the way a coral reef is built by organisms so small you cannot see them individually but whose collective work creates a structure that can withstand a hurricane. The trust had conditions. Specific, deliberate, unmistakable conditions written in language that I would later learn bore all the hallmarks of a woman who had spent 30 years managing legal documents for a public institution. The sole beneficiary was Russell James Hale. That is me. The trust would disperse 10 years after the grantor's death, which meant 2027. And the disbursement was contingent on one condition. The beneficiary must maintain legal ownership of the residential property and lighthouse structure located at 47 Gull Point Road, Lubec, Maine, at the time of disbursement. She had built a fortress, not out of stone or steel, but out of paper and patience, and the foresight of a woman who understood that the most dangerous threats to a home do not come from the weather. They come from the people inside it. Maggie had designed a trust that could only be claimed by me, and only if I still owned the house and the lighthouse. She had tied the money to the land, and the land to me, and she had done it 22 years before Troy ever asked whether the lighthouse was part of the deed. I did not know any of this in 2023. I did not know the trust existed. I did not know Maggie had been paying insurance premiums for 35 years. I did not know that the woman who left a thermos of coffee at the base of my lighthouse every morning had also been quietly engineering my financial survival from a filing cabinet in the back office of a small-town library. But Troy knew. And the moment he read that document, the game changed. He did not tell me. He did not tell Kristen immediately either, though she found out within the week. What he did, within 48 hours of reading the trust, was contact a lawyer, not a local attorney, not someone from Washington County who might know me, or know Angus, or know the community well enough to ask uncomfortable questions. He called Marcus Devlin, a real estate and estate litigation attorney in Portland, 260 miles south of Lubec, far enough away that the name Russell Hale meant nothing, and the lighthouse on Gull Point was just a line on a property record. I would learn about Devlin later. I would learn about the emails. I would learn about the plan that Troy and Devlin constructed together over the following months, a plan to remove me from my own home before the trust dispersed, so that the condition of ownership would fail and the money would pass to the next eligible party. Troy, my son, the boy who took his first steps in the shadow of that tower, but in the autumn of 2023, I knew none of it. I only knew that Troy had become quieter, more careful. He stopped making comments about the property. He stopped leaving renovation plans where I could see them. He was polite at dinner. He offered to clear the dishes, and that shift in behavior frightened me more than anything he had done in 6 years, because a man who has been loud about his intentions does not go quiet unless he has found a better way to get what he wants. The trust was my wife's final act of love. A lighthouse she built out of paper and foresight to keep me safe after she was gone. And my son looked at it the way he had looked at my property the day he stepped out of his truck 6 years earlier. Not with gratitude, with calculation. He was not reading a mother's gift. He was reading a blueprint. And what he saw in those pages was not protection. It was an obstacle. One he intended to remove. I walked to church that Sunday the way I had walked to church every Sunday for 40 years, slowly, with my coat buttoned to the collar and my Bible in my left hand and the salt air pressing against my face like a hand that had been there so long, I no longer noticed it. The road from Gull Point to the Congregational Church is 1.25 miles along the shore road. I drove it in 12 minutes because I have never been a man who rushes toward anything, including God. The church smelled the way it always smelled: old pine, candle wax, and the faint sweetness of the lilacs that Eleanor Cabot placed on the altar every Sunday from May through June because her grandmother had done it, and her mother had done it, and Eleanor was not the kind of woman who broke a chain. I sat in the third pew. I have sat in the third pew since 1983, the year Maggie and I were married in that building. She sat to my left. After she died, I did not move to the center of the pew. I stayed on my side. Her side stayed empty. Some habits are not habits. They are monuments. Pastor Whitfield read from Psalms that morning. I do not remember which one. I remember the light through the east window falling across the hymnals in the pew rack, turning the red covers amber. I remember the sound of the congregation singing, voices that I had known for decades, blending into a sound that was less like music and more like the hum of a building that has held the same purpose for 160 years. I remember thinking that this was the only hour of my week that still felt like it belonged entirely to me. The service ended at 11:15. I shook Pastor Whitfield's hand at the door. He held it a moment longer than usual and said, "You look well, Russell." I said thank you. I walked to my truck in the gravel lot. The sky was high and clear, the kind of spring sky that makes the bay look like hammered tin. I started the engine. I pulled onto the shore road, and I drove home. 12 minutes. That is all the time it took for my life to divide into before and after. I saw it before I understood it. The front door looked the same. The porch looked the same. The clapboard siding, the kitchen window, the roof line against the sky, everything in its place. But when I stepped out of the truck and walked to the front steps and reached into my pocket for my key, my hand already knew. The way your hand knows when it reaches for a railing that is not there. The absence registers before the reason does. I put the key in the lock. It did not turn. I pulled it out, examined it, put it back in. It did not turn. The lock was new. I could see the difference now. The old lock had been brass, dulled by 20 years of salt air. This one was bright, chrome. The kind of lock you buy when you want to keep someone out and you want them to know it. I walked around to the kitchen door. New lock. Same chrome. Same refusal. I walked across the yard to the lighthouse. 212 steps from the house. I counted them the way I always did. Except this time I was not counting out of habit. I was counting because the numbers were the only thing in my life that still behaved the way I expected them to. The lighthouse door had a new lock as well. 3 doors. 3 locks. Every entrance to my own life sealed shut while I was sitting in the third pew, listening to psalms. I walked back to the front of the house. Troy was standing on the porch. He was wearing a collared shirt I had never seen before, and his arms were crossed, and he was leaning against the railing I had built with Maggie in 1989. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man standing on his own porch. And that was the thing that nearly broke me. Not the locks, not the words he was about to say. The posture, the ease, the way he had already arranged his body to fit the shape of ownership, as though my absence from this property were not a theft, but a natural transition. "The locks are new," he said. "So is the situation. You should find somewhere else, old man." Kristen was standing in the living room window. I could see her silhouette through the glass. She was holding her phone in front of her, angled toward me. She was recording. A woman who had worked as a paralegal for 3 years knew exactly what documentation looked like, and she was building hers in real time. I stood in the yard. The wind came off the bay behind me, carrying the smell of salt and rockweed and the low-tide mud that Maggie used to say smelled like the earth, remembering what it was before people arrived. I could hear the waves. I could hear the gulls. I could hear my own breathing. Steady. And even. Because 36 years of Coast Guard discipline had taught me that the moment your breathing changes is the moment you lose control of the situation. I did not shout. I did not plead. I did not ask him why, or how, or what he thought he was doing. I knew why. I had known for years. I had simply chosen not to say it out loud because saying it would have made it real, and I had spent 10 years preferring the version of my son that existed before I started counting his words and measuring his silences. I looked at Troy. I looked at the lighthouse behind him, locked. Its door frame painted white over the place where his mother's name still waited beneath the surface. And I smiled. "Son," I said, "do you know whose name your mother carved into that lighthouse door?" His face changed. Not the way a face changes when someone is surprised. The way a face changes when someone realizes they have miscalculated. The way a hull shifts when it strikes something beneath the waterline that the charts did not show. His mouth opened. It closed. His arms uncrossed. His weight shifted off the railing. And for 3 full seconds, the only sound between us was the wind and the gulls and the waves against the rocks below the bluff. He did not answer. He did not need to. The question was not for him. It was for me. A reminder, spoken out loud in the salt air of my own front yard, that the woman who built this life with me had carved her name into its foundation. and no amount of paint or chrome or legal paperwork could change that. I turned around. I walked east across the field toward Angus McBride's house. 500 yards of grass and rock and spring mud. I did not look back. A captain does not look back at the harbor when he is heading into open water. He looks at the horizon and he sets his course. And my course, at that moment, was the house of the only man in Lubeck who had been preparing for this day longer than I had. Angus was standing on his porch when I came across the field. He was not surprised. He was not alarmed. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee, and the screen door was already propped open with his boot, as though he had watched the whole thing from his kitchen window, and had started brewing the moment Troy stepped onto my porch. Knowing Angus, that is exactly what he had done. I climbed his steps. He handed me a mug without a word. The coffee was black and hot and tasted like the last 30 years of our friendship, which is to say it was strong and it did not apologize for being what it was. I expected you an hour ago, Angus said. I watched him change the locks at 7 this morning. He had a locksmith from Machias. White van. I wrote down the plate number. Of course he had. Angus McBride had spent 50 years reading water and weather, and the behavior of men who make their living against both. He did not miss details. He filed them the way I filed navigation logs. Automatically, instinctively, and with the understanding that the thing you record today may be the thing that saves you tomorrow. We sat on his porch for 5 minutes without speaking. The bay was flat and silver in the late morning light. The lighthouse stood on the bluff to the east, visible from Angus's property, the way it was visible from everywhere in Lubeck, a fixed point against the sky, unchanged and unreachable. Locked, painted over. Mine. Then Angus set down his coffee and went inside. He came back carrying a wooden box. It was small, maybe 12 inches long, 8 inches wide. The kind of box a fisherman keeps spare hooks in or a woman keeps old letters in. The wood was dark and smooth with age. There was no lock. The lid was held shut by a single brass clasp. Maggie brought this to me in February of 2017, Angus said. 2 months before she died. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should keep it until you needed it. He set the box on the porch railing between us. She said I would know when. I looked at the box. I looked at Angus. His face was steady, the way it always was, but his eyes were wet. In 30 years of friendship, I had never seen Angus McBride's eyes wet. Not at Maggie's funeral. Not at his own wife's funeral 12 years before that. Not once. She knew, Angus said quietly. I do not know how, but she knew something like this could happen. I opened the clasp. Inside the box, wrapped in a piece of cloth that I recognized as a scrap from the quilt Maggie's grandmother had sewn, were 3 items. A small brass key with a paper tag tied to it, a sealed envelope with my name written on the front in Maggie's handwriting, and a folded receipt from Machias First National Bank, dated March of 2016, 1 year before her death, confirming the rental of a safe deposit box in her name. The key, the envelope, the receipt. 3 objects that together weighed less than a deck of cards and held the entire future of my life inside them. I did not open the envelope. Not yet. I put everything back in the box, and I looked at Angus and I said, "Take me to Machias." He was already reaching for his truck keys. The drive from Lubeck to Machias is 40 minutes on a good day. Angus drove. I held the box on my lap with both hands, and I did not speak, and he did not ask me to. The road followed the coast through Whiting and Cutler, past blueberry barrens and spruce stands, and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with a view of the water. I watched the landscape pass, and I thought about Maggie, sitting in Angus's kitchen 5 years ago, handing him a wooden box and saying, "Keep this until he needs it." She had known. Not the specifics, not the locks, or the trust, or the 10 years of slow erosion, but she had known the shape of what was possible because Maggie had spent 30 years managing documents and reading people and understanding that love without preparation is just sentiment. Machias First National Bank sits on Main Street in a brick building with tall windows and a lobby that smells like old carpet and the particular silence of a place where people keep things they are afraid to lose. I presented the key and my identification. A woman in a navy blazer led me to a small room in the back. She set the safe deposit box on the table and left me alone. I opened it. Inside were 3 documents. The first was the original trust agreement, notarized and witnessed, bearing Maggie's signature and the signatures of 2 witnesses I did not recognize. The second was a complete record of 35 years of insurance premium payments. Every receipt, every canceled check, every statement, organized chronologically in a manila folder with tabs that Maggie had labeled in her careful blue ink. The third was the envelope. I opened it with hands that were steady only because I told them to be. Inside was a single page of stationery from the Lubeck Memorial Library. Maggie's handwriting. Blue ink. The same pen she had used to write notes in the margins of every book she ever loved. "Russell," she wrote, "if you are reading this, someone is trying to take what is ours. I am sorry I could not tell you while I was alive. I was afraid you would think I did not trust you. The truth is I trust you more than anyone. But I also know that trust without a backup plan is just hope, and hope is not a strategy. I built this trust the way you built that lighthouse. To stand when the storm comes. The money is yours. The house is yours. The lighthouse is yours. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Do not let anyone paint over our name. Fight, Russell. The light is yours. All my love. Margaret." I sat in that room for 10 minutes. I held the letter against my chest. I did not cry. I did not need to. The tears would come later, on Angus's porch, in the dark, when no one was watching. In that small bank room, I only felt one thing: certainty. The certainty of a man who has been sailing without charts for 10 years and has just been handed a compass. My wife had been dead for 10 years, and she was still keeping me safe. She had built a fortress out of paper and foresight and 35 years of deposits that I never knew about, and she had placed the key in the hands of the one man she trusted as much as she trusted me. I drove back to Lubeck with Angus. I called Clara Whitmore from his kitchen phone that evening. Angus had her number written on a piece of paper in his wallet. He had been carrying it for 3 months, waiting for this day. Clara answered on the 4th ring. I told her my name. I told her I needed a lawyer. She said, "Come to Machias tomorrow morning. Bring everything." I hung up. I sat at Angus's kitchen table with the box in front of me and the letter inside it and the bay visible through the window. Dark and still under the first stars of evening. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt something beneath my feet that I had almost forgotten existed. Solid ground. Clara Whitmore's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building on Court Street in Machias, above a hardware store and across from the county courthouse. The room was small, lined with bookshelves, and smelled like the particular combination of strong coffee and old case law that I would come to associate with the feeling of being defended. She was standing behind her desk when I walked in, 5'6", gray hair cut short, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She wore no jewelry except a Navy JAG Corps ring on her right hand that she never took off. Clara Whitmore had served 14 years as a Judge Advocate General in the United States Navy, prosecuting military law across 3 continents, before returning to Maine to open a private practice, specializing in maritime and property disputes. She had represented fishing families in boundary cases, lobstermen in licensing disputes, and 3 different lighthouse preservation trusts in ownership conflicts with federal agencies. She did not lose often, and when she did, Angus told me, she made the other side wish they had never filed. I laid everything on her desk. The trust, the letter, the insurance records, the property tax receipts I had kept for 10 years, the photographs of Maggie's books and portrait being moved, the date-stamped images of the lighthouse inscription before and after the paint, my 10 years of daily maintenance logs, 3,652 entries in my own handwriting. Clara examined each item without speaking. She held the trust up to the window light the way a jeweler examines a stone, turning it, reading every line, her finger tracing the notarized signatures at the bottom. She read Maggie's letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. "Your wife was the smartest person in this story, Russell," she said. "This trust is airtight. The disbursement condition is specific, enforceable, and tied directly to your legal ownership. If you own the property and the lighthouse on the date of disbursement, the money is yours. If you do not, the trust fails and the funds revert to the estate, which your son would contest. She designed it so that the only way to steal the money is to steal your home first." She picked up my maintenance logs and fanned through the pages. 10 years of daily entries, she said. "Do you understand what this is? This is not just a record of lighthouse upkeep. This is 10 years of documented cognitive function. Consistent handwriting, accurate dates, detailed technical observations. No attorney on earth can argue that the man who wrote these logs is mentally incompetent. Your wife gave you the trust. You gave yourself the evidence." Then Clara opened her laptop. She typed for 3 minutes. She turned the screen toward me. She had pulled the Federal Registry for the National Lighthouse Preservation Act, and there, in the database, was a filing dated February of 2024 bearing my name. An application to transfer custodial ownership of the lighthouse at 47 Gull Point Road from Russell James Hale to Troy Russell Hale. "I did not file that," I said. "I know," Clara said, "because the signature on this application does not match a single letter in 3,600 pages of your handwriting." She placed my maintenance log beside the screen. The difference was obvious even to me. The signature on the federal form was smooth, practiced, and slightly too even. My actual handwriting was the handwriting of an engineer. Angular, precise, consistent in its imperfections. They were not the same hand. She leaned back. "This is federal document fraud, Russell. Whoever filed this forged your signature on a federal application. That is not a property dispute. That is a criminal offense, and I know exactly how to prove it." That evening, while Clara built the legal case in Machias, Angus built something else in Lubeck. I did not know about the meeting until I arrived at his house that night and saw the cars. 7, 8, maybe 9 vehicles lining the dirt road east of his property. More than Angus usually had for any occasion. I walked up the porch steps and through the screen door and I stopped. Angus's living room was full. 14 people seated in folding chairs, on the couch arms, leaning against the windowsill by the wood stove. The room smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the salt air that comes through every window in Lubeck, whether you open them or not. Folding chairs creaked as people turned to see me in the doorway. I knew these faces. Some I had known for decades. Some I recognized from the post office, or the harbor, or the pew behind mine at church. And every one of them was looking at me with something I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. Purpose. I am not a man who cries easily. I have buried a wife. I have endured 10 years of a man dismantling my home from the inside. But I had to look at the ceiling for a long moment before I could say hello. Pastor Whitfield spoke first. His voice was deep and unhurried. The voice of a man who had been delivering difficult truths from a pulpit for 22 years. "Russell," he said, "this town does not forget its own. You tell us where to show up and when, and we will be there." Dr. Callahan stood next. He was the physician Troy had called 2 years earlier to report my supposed cognitive decline. He looked at me and he said, "Troy Hale called my office and told me you were losing your mind. I have known you for 22 years, Russell. I have watched you maintain a federal lighthouse with daily precision that most of my younger patients cannot match with their grocery lists. I will testify to your competence under oath." "You tell me when." Ellen Park, the librarian who had replaced Maggie, confirmed that Troy had accessed the back office filing cabinet in the autumn of 2023. She had found it unlocked one morning and reported it to no one because she did not know what was inside. She was willing to testify. Deputy Wes Thibodeau, 15 years with the Washington County Sheriff's Office, said he had responded to 3 separate noise complaints at my address over the past 2 years. All 3 times, Troy was the one shouting. All 3 times, I was calm. All 3 reports were on file at the station with dates, times, and observations. Then Hank Dawson stood up. Hank was 70 years old, a retired petty officer first class who had served under me on the cutter Reliance out of Eastport for 11 years. He was broad and weathered, and he spoke the way all Coast Guard men speak, as though every word had been weighed against the possibility that it might be the last thing someone hears before a wave hits. I served with this man in 30-foot seas off George's Bank. Hank said, if Russell Hale is incompetent, then the entire United States Coast Guard owes the Atlantic Ocean an apology. The room murmured. Someone in the back said amen, and it did not sound religious. It sounded like a promise. One by one, they signed. Angus had prepared the affidavit forms in advance. Typed, personalized, with a space for each statement. The scratch of 14 pens on paper filled the room. I watched each hand move across the page and I memorized every face. Troy had money and lawyers. I had the town of Lubeck. And I promise you, in Down East Maine, a town is heavier than a checkbook. Clara Whitmore did not practice law the way most attorneys do. She practiced it the way a ship's captain navigates a minefield, with absolute precision, zero tolerance for assumption, and the understanding that the thing you fail to see beneath the surface is the thing that sinks you. The 2 weeks between the community meeting and the court date were the most precise and relentless 14 days of legal work I have ever witnessed. Clara filed subpoenas for Troy's email records through his internet provider. She filed a preservation order on the Lubeck Memorial Library's access logs. She requested federal records from the National Park Service regarding the lighthouse transfer application. And she did all of it within 72 hours of our first meeting, because Clara understood something that Troy and his lawyer did not. Speed is a weapon, and the side that moves first controls the current. The emails arrived on a Tuesday. 6 of them, printed on Clara's desk in chronological order, each one between Troy Hale and Marcus Devlin, spanning from October of 2023 through January of 2024. I sat across from Clara and read them one at a time while she watched my face. The first email was dated October 11th, 2023. Troy to Devlin. Subject line: Property and Trust Inquiry. The language was careful, exploratory, the tone of a man testing the water before he commits to the dive. He described the trust in general terms. He described the property. He described the ownership condition. And then he asked the question that collapsed any pretense of innocent inquiry. What legal avenues exist for transferring property ownership from an elderly deed holder who may lack the capacity to manage his own affairs? The second email was Devlin's response. Detailed, clinical. A menu of options laid out the way a contractor lays out demolition plans. Adverse possession timelines. Competency challenges. Conservatorship filings. Each one described with the casual professionalism of a man who has done this before and charges by the hour. The third and fourth emails discussed the lighthouse specifically. Troy had asked whether the lighthouse could be separated from the residential deed. Devlin explained the Lighthouse Preservation Act process, noted that a custodial transfer required the current owner's signature, and suggested, in language so careful it almost disguised itself as legal caution, that signatures could be, quote, facilitated under appropriate circumstances. The fifth email was dated November 15th, 2023. This was the one that changed everything. Troy to Devlin. 6 sentences. I can recite them from memory because I have read them more times than any navigation chart I ever studied. Recommend accelerating removal of current deed holder before trust disbursement date. Subject is elderly, isolated, minimal community ties. No immediate family presence in the area. Competency challenge should be filed as contingency. Timeline for Lighthouse Act transfer is on schedule. Advise on next steps for residential property claim. Removal of current deed holder. That is what my son called me. Not Russell. Not my father. Not the man who built this house. Current deed holder. Sef. In. A. Of. No. Removal of current deed holder. 6 words that converted 40 years of marriage, 36 years of service, and a home I had framed with my own hands into a line item on a legal strategy memo. Elderly, isolated, minimal community ties. He had written those words in November. 3 months later, 14 people in Angus McBride's living room had signed affidavits, proving every one of those words wrong. But Troy did not know about the affidavits. He did not know about Angus's meeting. He did not know that the community he had dismissed as minimal had been watching him for years and had decided, collectively and without hesitation, that enough was enough. The 6th email was Devlin's reply. A timeline, a fee structure, a list of required documents, and a note at the bottom that read, "If subject contests, be prepared for a competency hearing. We should have medical documentation ready." Clara set down the last email. She removed her glasses and placed them on the desk. She looked at me, the way a commanding officer looks at a sailor before a mission briefing, with clarity and without comfort. "Russell," she said. "Marcus Devlin is the attorney who filed the Lighthouse transfer application. He is also the attorney who will represent Troy in court on Monday. The man who has been planning to steal your home since October of 2023 is the same man who will argue that you lack the mental capacity to manage your own affairs." She let that settle. "This is not 2 separate battles," she said. "It was never 2 separate battles. It is one coordinated attack. And every piece of it was planned before your son ever changed a lock on your door." I leaned back in the chair. It creaked beneath me. The office was quiet. The hardware store below us was closed for the evening, and the only sound was the faint hum of the courthouse lights across the street. I looked at Clara. "How do we win?" I said. "We already have," she said. "They just do not know it yet." I drove back to Lubeck that evening in Angus's truck. He had insisted on driving every trip since the locks were changed, not because he thought I could not drive, but because Angus believed that a man fighting for his home should not have to fight the road at the same time. I had lost 10 pounds in 2 weeks. I want you to understand what that means for a 73-year-old man who was already lean from a lifetime of hauling lines and climbing lighthouse stairs. It means belts tightened to holes that did not exist before. It means standing in Angus's bathroom mirror and seeing the bones in my collarbone for the first time since boot camp. It means Angus standing in his kitchen at 10 at night holding a bowl of clam chowder and refusing to leave until I finished every spoonful. He brought soup every night for those 2 weeks. He slept on his own couch so I would not have to sleep in an empty house that was not mine. Some mornings I found coffee already made when I came downstairs, and those mornings were the only ones that did not feel like walking into a current I could not swim against. The night before the hearing, I could not sleep. I walked outside at 2 in the morning. The air was raw. March in Down East Maine is not spring. It is winter, pretending to negotiate. I stood in Angus's yard and looked across the water at my lighthouse. The light was off. It had been off since Troy changed the locks. The tower stood against the sky like a dark column, solid and silent, holding its shape the way it had held its shape through every storm since I rebuilt it. Beneath the paint on its door, my wife's name was waiting. And beneath the surface of a courtroom in Machias, every piece of evidence Clara had assembled was waiting too. The emails, the forged signature, the affidavits, the maintenance logs, Maggie's letter. All of it, patient and precise and ready. Some things cannot be erased. They can only be hidden. And hidden things, given enough time and the right hands, always come back to the surface. Angus drove because my hands would not stop shaking. Not from fear. From the kind of electricity that runs through a man's body when he has spent 2 weeks building something and is about to find out whether it holds. The highway between Lubeck and Machias is 40 minutes of frozen coast and gray sky. the road cutting through stands of bare spruce and past rocky inlets where the tide leaves dark lines on the granite like watermarks on a chart. Neither of us spoke for the first 20 miles. We did not need to. Angus knew what we were driving toward, and I knew what I was leaving behind. We arrived at the Washington County Courthouse at 8:45. The building sat on Court Street, 100 yards from Clara's office, a white clapboard structure with tall windows and a set of granite steps worn smooth by 140 years of people walking in with problems and walking out with verdicts. The March air was sharp. The wind carried the smell of the Machias River 2 blocks south, mud and snowmelt, and the faint mineral scent of water that has traveled a long distance to get where it is going. Clara was already inside. She was seated at the left table, her folder open, her pen aligned parallel to the edge of the table, her reading glasses on. She nodded at me once. I sat down. Angus took the chair directly behind me. I could feel him there the way you feel a bulkhead at your back during heavy seas. Solid. Unmoving. Present. On the other side of the room sat Troy. He wore a suit I had never seen before. Dark blue, fitted. The kind of suit a man buys when he wants to look like someone who has always had money. His hair was combed. His shoes were polished. He sat with his hands folded on the table and his jaw set and his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, and he did not look at me. Not once. Beside him sat Kristen. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her posture was rigid. She held a leather folder in her lap and she did not open it. She looked at the table. She looked at the wall. She looked everywhere except at me. Marcus Devlin sat at the end of their table. 2 associates flanked him, both in dark suits, both with matching briefcases. Devlin was 55. Gray at the temples, with the composed bearing of a man who had argued enough cases to mistake routine for invincibility. He glanced at Clara once when we entered. She did not return the look. At the head of the room sat Judge Patricia Ames. She was 60 years old with silver-framed reading glasses and a stillness about her that suggested she had heard every argument a courtroom could produce and had stopped being impressed by any of them. When she spoke, the room obeyed. "We will begin," she said. Nothing more. Devlin stood first. He was polished. I will give him that. His voice filled the room without strain, and his argument was cleaner than I had expected. He described Troy as a devoted son who had returned home to care for his aging father. He described 10 years of property maintenance, tax payments, and daily involvement in the upkeep of the home and lighthouse. He described me as a man whose cognitive abilities had declined over the past several years. A man who had become confused, forgetful, and increasingly dependent on the care his son provided. He cited the property tax records showing Troy's name for 7 consecutive years. He cited the lighthouse transfer application as evidence of an orderly transition of custodial responsibility. He spoke for 18 minutes, and for 18 minutes, every word he said was technically accurate and fundamentally a lie. That is the particular danger of a skilled attorney. He does not invent facts. He arranges them. He takes the truth and he trims it and he shapes it and he presents it at an angle where the shadow it casts looks nothing like the object that made it. When Devlin sat down, the room was quiet. I could feel Angus shift in his chair behind me. For one moment, sitting in that courtroom listening to a man in a blue suit describe 10 years of my son's parasitic occupation as devoted caregiving, I felt doubt, not because Devlin was right, because he was good. And good lawyers can make wrong things sound reasonable. Clara stood. She did not raise her voice. She never did. She placed the original trust document on the table, followed by Maggie's letter, followed by the notarized insurance records. She placed my maintenance logs beside them, 3,652 daily entries in my own handwriting. She placed the 14 affidavits in a single stack. She placed the original property tax receipts from 1986 through 2017, all bearing my name, beside the receipts from 2017 through 2024, bearing Troy's. Then she spoke. "Your Honor," she said, "a lottery ticket is a piece of paper. A trust is a legal instrument. and a forged signature on a federal application is a crime. But before we discuss any of those things, I would like to address the claim that my client lacks the mental capacity to manage his own affairs. She picked up my maintenance log and held it so that Judge Ames could see the pages. This is a daily inspection record for the lighthouse at 47 Gull Point Road, maintained by Russell Hale, for 10 consecutive years. 3,652 entries, every date accurate, every observation detailed, every technical notation consistent with a man who spent 36 years as a commissioned officer in the United States Coast Guard. A man who maintained this log with this level of precision is not a man suffering cognitive decline. He is a man whose home has been systematically occupied by the people he trusted most. She set the log down. The trust before you was executed by Margaret Hale in 2002. It is notarized, witnessed, and legally unambiguous. The beneficiary is Russell Hale. The disbursement condition requires that Mr. Hale maintain legal ownership of the residential property in Lighthouse. The respondent's entire strategy depends on removing my client from that property before the trust disperses. Every action taken over the past 10 years, the tax payments, the lock changes, the false medical reports, and the forged federal application serves that single objective. She paused. She looked at Judge Ames. Your Honor, counsel has referenced the Lighthouse transfer application as evidence of an orderly transition. I would like to enter into evidence that application alongside 10 years of my client's handwriting. She placed both documents side by side, the forged signature and my maintenance logs. Even from where I sat, the difference was visible. The forgery was smooth and deliberate. My handwriting was angular and precise. They were not the same hand. Judge Ames leaned forward. She examined both documents for a long time. Then she removed her glasses and looked at the room. Counselor, she said to Clara, you mentioned additional evidence in your filing. Emails. Clara nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Evidence obtained through lawful subpoena that establishes a pattern of premeditated fraud spanning from October 2023 through January 2024. She reached for her folder. I watched Troy's eyes drop to the printed pages in her hand, and for the first time since I had known him, for the first time in 10 years of watching my son measure and calculate and perform, I saw something on his face I had never seen before. Real fear. Clara placed a single printed page on the table. Then she placed it on the overhead display. The words appeared on the wall behind Judge Ames in black type, 12-point font, and I watched every person in that room read them at the same time. It was like watching a wave hit a shore. You could see the impact travel from face to face. From Troy Hale to Marcus Devlin. November 15th, 2023. Subject: Property Acquisition Timeline. Clara began to read aloud. Her voice was steady and unhurried. The voice of a woman who had waited weeks for this moment and intended to let every syllable land the way a depth charge lands, slow on the way down and devastating on arrival. Recommend accelerating removal of current deed holder before trust disbursement date. Subject is elderly, isolated, minimal community ties. No immediate family presence in the area. Competency challenge should be filed as contingency. Timeline for Lighthouse Act transfer is on schedule. Advise on next steps for residential property claim. She let the silence hold. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The water pitcher on the table sat untouched, sweating a ring onto the wood that nobody wiped away. Nobody moved. Clara placed the remaining 5 emails on the display one at a time. She did not read them all aloud. She did not need to. The first one had done the work, but she laid them in chronological order so Judge Ames could see the progression. The careful architecture of a plan designed to strip a 73-year-old man of his home, his lighthouse, and his wife's final gift while he was still living under the same roof as the people planning it. Then she turned to Marcus Devlin. The sender of this email is Troy Hale, seated to your left. The recipient is you, Mr. Devlin. This email was sent on November 15th, 2023, 4 years before my client was locked out of his own home. She paused. The same Marcus Devlin who filed the Lighthouse transfer application bearing a forged signature. The same Marcus Devlin who is seated in this courtroom today, arguing that my client lacks the mental capacity to manage his affairs. The architect of the property scheme and the attorney arguing incompetence are the same person. Devlin's face had gone the color of old sail canvas. He straightened his tie. He looked at the table. He did not look at Troy. He did not look at Judge Ames. He looked at the table the way a man looks at the floor of a boat that is taking on water, and there is nothing left to bail with. This was a preliminary consultation, he said. A hypothetical exploration of legal options. Nothing actionable was undertaken based on these communications. Judge Ames removed her glasses. She set them on the bench. She looked at Devlin with the particular stillness of a woman who has been lied to by professionals for 30 years and can identify the exact moment when a defense becomes a confession. That is not what I asked you, Mr. Devlin. Is this your email address? Yes or no? Yes. The room exhaled. Not a sound anyone made deliberately. A collective release of held breath, the way a crew exhales when the rescue boat clears the breakwater and the open sea hits. Removal of current deed holder. Elderly. Isolated. Minimal community ties. I want you to sit with those words the way I sat with them in that room. Every one of them was about me. I was the deed holder. I was the elderly subject. I was the man with minimal community ties because my wife was dead and my daughter had been told by her own brother that her father did not want to hear her voice. Troy had reduced my existence to a problem to be solved. A variable to be removed from an equation so the numbers would balance in his favor. And he had put it in writing 4 years before he ever changed a lock on my door. Troy had been gripping the edge of the table through all of this. His knuckles were white. His jaw was working the way a man's jaw works when the muscles are clenched so tight the teeth ache. Devlin leaned toward him and whispered something. Troy pulled his arm away like the touch burned. Then he stood up. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound that cut through the courtroom the way a hull scrapes against rock in shallow water. Judge Ames opened her mouth to speak, but Troy was already past the point where a judge's voice could reach him. That is out of context, he said. His voice was loud. Too loud for a courtroom. Too loud for a room where a woman in silver glasses held the authority to decide what happened next. That was a hypothetical. A consultation. I maintained that property for 10 years. 10 years. I fixed the roof. I cleared the snow. I paid the taxes. I did everything while he sat in his chair and talked to a lighthouse like it was a person. Mr. Hale, Judge Ames said. Sit down. No. No. You need to hear this. You need to understand what I gave up. 10 years of my life in that house. In that town. In that village at the end of the earth where nothing happens and nobody leaves, and the biggest event of the year is a lobster festival. I gave up Portland. I gave up my career. I gave up everything. He was pointing now. His finger jabbing the air between himself and the judge, like he was trying to puncture something that only he could see. And for what? For a man who cannot even let go of a dead woman's name on a door. For $5 million locked in a vault that I cannot touch because she wrote a piece of paper 20 years ago? You have any idea what it is like watching $5 million sit in a vault while you are stuck in a fishing village with a man who talks to a dead woman's lighthouse? His voice cracked. Not with sorrow. With fury. 10 years. 10 years. I waited. And he just kept going. He would not stop. He would not slow down. He would not get confused or forget or fall apart the way old men are supposed to. He just kept climbing those stairs every morning and writing in that notebook and talking to that light like she was still inside it. The room went silent. Not the silence between sentences. The silence that comes when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. When the air itself pulls back from the sound the way water pulls back from a shore before a wave it did not expect. I heard Angus shift in his chair behind me. I heard the scratch of Judge Ames's pen as she wrote every word down, slowly, deliberately, each letter pressed into the page with the weight of a ruling that was already forming in her mind. And then Kristen stood up. She did not look at Troy. She did not look at Devlin. She looked at Judge Ames. And she said, "Your Honor, I would like to make a statement." Every person in that courtroom held their breath. Even Judge Ames paused, her pen hovering above her notepad, waiting. Kristen Hale stood with both hands flat on the table in front of her. The way I have seen officers stand when they are about to deliver a report they know will change everything. She was not shaking. She was not crying. Her voice, when it came, was the steadiest sound in the room. "Your Honor, my name is Kristen Marie Hale. I married Troy Hale in 2015. I have a paralegal certificate from the University of Southern Maine. I am aware of the legal consequences of what I am about to say." Marcus Devlin leaned toward her and whispered something. Kristen did not look at him. She looked at Judge Ames, the way you look at the only exit in a burning building. "I am not speaking on behalf of my husband. I am not speaking on behalf of Mr. Devlin. I am speaking for myself, under my own will. And I would like this entered into the record." Judge Ames nodded once. "Proceed, Mrs. Hale." Troy grabbed Kristen's arm. She pulled it free, without breaking eye contact with the judge. That single motion carried more weight than any document Clara had presented. It was a severance. Clean, deliberate, final. In October of 2023, Kristen began, "My husband discovered a revocable living trust in the back office of the Lubeck Memorial Library. The trust was created by Margaret Hale in 2002 and funded by a life insurance policy valued at approximately $5 million. The sole beneficiary is Russell James Hale. The disbursement condition requires Mr. Hale to retain ownership of the house and lighthouse at 47 Gull Point Road, Lubeck, Maine, at the time of payout." She paused. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the Machias River through the walls. Within 48 hours of finding that document, my husband contacted Marcus Devlin. I was present for that phone call. I heard my husband say, and I quote, "There is $5 million sitting in a trust, and the only thing between me and that money is the old man's name on a deed." End quote. Troy stood again. "She is lying." "She is." Judge Ames raised one hand. "Mr. Hale, you will sit down, or you will be removed. This is your only warning." Troy sat. His face was a color I have never seen on a living person, somewhere between ash and fever. Kristen continued without looking at him. "Between November 2023 and February 2024, I witnessed my husband and Mr. Devlin develop a three-phase plan. Phase 1. Establish adverse possession, standing through property tax payments, already filed in Troy's name. Phase 2. File a custodial ownership application under the National Lighthouse Preservation Act using a forged signature. Phase 3. Initiate a competency challenge against Russell Hale to obtain conservatorship, which would give Troy legal authority to sell the property, void the trust condition, and redirect the funds." Clara sat perfectly still beside me. She did not move, did not write. She did not need to. The opposing counsel's own family was dismantling the case from the inside. I also witnessed my husband instruct Mr. Devlin to contact Dr. James Callahan in Lubeck, requesting a preliminary cognitive assessment of Russell Hale. Dr. Callahan refused. My husband then discussed finding a physician in Portland who could provide a favorable report without a personal examination. Judge Ames wrote steadily. The scratch of her pen was the only sound competing with Kristen's voice. On the morning of the lock change Sunday, spring 2027, I was the one who recorded the confrontation between Troy and his father from the living room window. I still have the original video file on my phone. I recorded it because I knew that morning would be the last time Troy could pretend this was anything other than what it was. She reached into her jacket pocket and placed her phone on the table, screen facing up. I have the video. I have text messages between Troy and Mr. Devlin dating back 14 months. I have photographs of the original trust document taken before Troy removed it from the library filing cabinet. And I have a written timeline of every action my husband took to remove his father from his own home. The courtroom exhaled. Not a gasp, something lower, something heavier. The sound of people understanding that the betrayal had a witness all along. Devlin stood. Your Honor, this testimony is— Sit down, Mr. Devlin. Judge Ames did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Mrs. Hale, are you prepared to submit these materials as evidence? Yes, Your Honor. All of them. I looked at my son. Troy Hale sat with his hands on his knees, staring at the table. He did not look at Kristen. He did not look at me. He looked at nothing, and nothing looked back. I wanted to feel victory. I wanted the satisfaction of watching his plan collapse, the way a rotten timber gives way under its own weight. But sitting in that courtroom, watching a marriage dissolve in real time, watching my son's face empty of everything except the slow recognition that he had lost, I felt something else entirely. I felt tired. The kind of tired that 40 years of salt water and wind cannot teach you. The kind that only comes from loving someone who chose money over you. Kristen sat down. She folded her hands and looked straight ahead, at the seal of the state of Maine mounted on the wall behind Judge Ames. She did not look at Troy. She would never look at Troy the same way again. I understood that. I had watched the same expression on the faces of crew members who realized their captain had steered them into rocks on purpose. Judge Ames closed her notepad. She removed her glasses, set them on the bench, and addressed the room. This court will recess for 1 hour. When we reconvene, I will hear closing arguments. I advise all parties to use this time wisely. She struck the gavel once. The sound was sharp, clean, absolute, like a lighthouse door closing against the wind. 1 hour in a courthouse hallway is not the same as 1 hour anywhere else. Time does not move the way it should. It stretches in places, folds in others, and the silence between footsteps carries more weight than any conversation. I sat on a wooden bench in the corridor with Angus beside me. He did not speak. He handed me a thermos coffee, black, still warm. I did not ask where he got it. Angus McBride has carried coffee to every crisis in my life for 40 years. I held the thermos with both hands the way I used to hold the rail of a lifeboat before launch. Steady grip, steady breathing. Wait for the signal. Clara stood near the window at the far end of the hallway, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a voice too low to hear. Her posture had not changed since Kristen's testimony. Straight spine, squared shoulders, reading glasses pushed into her hair. She was not celebrating. Good lawyers do not celebrate before the gavel falls. She finished the call, walked back, and sat across from me. Russell, when we go back in, I need you to do one thing. What is that? Nothing. Sit still. Say nothing. Let the record speak. I nodded. 36 years in the Coast Guard teaches you that the hardest order to follow is the one that asks you to be still. Down the hall, Troy sat alone on a bench near the men's room. Kristen was gone. She had walked out of the courtroom after the recess was called and had not come back. Troy's attorney, Marcus Devlin, stood 6 feet from his client, looking at his phone with the expression of a man calculating how much distance he needed between himself and a sinking vessel. The 2 associates who had flanked Devlin that morning were nowhere in sight. The team was dissolving. Troy looked up once. Our eyes met across 40 feet of polished corridor floor. I expected anger. I expected defiance. The jaw-set stubbornness that had defined him since he was a boy, arguing over whose turn it was to stack firewood. But what I saw was something I had not seen on my son's face since he was 9 years old and fell through the ice on Johnson Pond, pure, unguarded fear. I looked away first. Not because I was weak, because I have pulled enough men out of cold water to know that fear, real fear, is not something you stare at. You reach for it, or you turn away. There is no middle ground. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors at 2:15 p.m. We filed back in. The same oak-paneled room, the same seal of the state of Maine on the wall, the same river smell drifting through the ventilation. But the room felt different, lighter, as if someone had opened a window that had been painted shut for years. Judge Patricia Ames entered. We stood. She sat. We sat. She placed a single sheet of paper on the bench in front of her and put on her silver-framed glasses. This court has reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties, including the original trust document executed by Margaret Ann Hale in 2002, the supporting insurance premium records spanning 35 years, the maintenance log kept by Mr. S. Russell Hale containing 3,652 daily entries, 14 sworn affidavits from residents of Lubec, Maine, the email correspondence between Mr. Troy Hale and Mr. Marcus Devlin, the testimony of Mrs. Kristen Hale, and the federal custodial ownership application filed under the National Lighthouse Preservation Act. She paused. The room held. It is the finding of this court that the trust executed by Margaret Ann Hale is valid, enforceable, and uncontested in its terms. The sole beneficiary is Russell James Hale. The disbursement condition that Mr. Hale retain ownership of the property at 47 Gull Point Road, Lubec, Maine remains satisfied. No legal transfer of ownership has occurred. I felt Angus's hand on my shoulder. One firm grip. He said nothing. It is further the finding of this court that the custodial ownership application submitted to the National Park Service was filed using a forged signature. Forensic comparison with Mr. Hale's authenticated handwriting samples confirms the signature on the federal application is not genuine. This matter will be referred to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Maine for investigation of federal document fraud. Devlin closed his eyes. He did not move, did not object. There was nothing left to object to. Regarding the claim of adverse possession, the tax payments made by Mr. Troy Hale over a period of 7 years do not satisfy the statutory requirements under Maine law, as the original deed holder maintained continuous residence and did not abandon the property. The adverse possession claim is denied. Judge Ames removed her glasses and looked directly at Troy. Mr. Hale, this court does not often address parties directly, but I want to be clear. Your father built that lighthouse with his own hands over 26 years. Your mother funded a trust to protect him. You attempted to take both. The law does not permit it. This court does not permit it. Troy did not stand. He did not speak. He sat with his hands flat on the table, the same posture Kristen had used an hour earlier, but where her stillness had carried purpose, his carried emptiness. Judge Ames struck the gavel. Case dismissed. The property at 47 Gull Point Road, Lubec, Maine, including the lighthouse and all associated structures, remains the sole legal property of Russell James Hale. Court is adjourned. The gavel sound was different this time. Not sharp. Not cutting. It was round, full, the way a bell sounds when it rings across open water and you know, before you even check the chart, that you are heading in the right direction. Clara turned to me. She extended her hand. I shook it. Her grip was firm, professional, and brief. It is over, Russell. I stood. My knees ached. 73 years of climbing lighthouse stairs and hauling wet rope will do that. Angus steadied my arm. Not because I needed it, but because that is what he does. That is what he has always done. I walked out of the courtroom into the April afternoon. The Machias River was running high with snowmelt, and the air smelled like pine and cold granite. I stopped on the courthouse steps and looked east, toward the coast, toward Lubec, toward the lighthouse I could not yet see, but knew was there the way a sailor knows the position of a light before it breaks the horizon. Maggie's voice, or the memory of it, moved through me like a current. The light is yours, Russell. It was always yours. I did not cry. I stood on those granite steps and breathed, and the breath tasted like salt, like home, like 40 years of mornings on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, and a woman who loved me enough to plan for the day she would not be there. Angus drove me home. He took the coastal route, Route 189, hugging the shoreline where the spruce trees lean east from decades of Atlantic wind. He did not ask which way I preferred. He knew. 40 years of friendship means you stop asking questions whose answers you already carry. Neither of us spoke for the first 20 minutes. The truck smelled like diesel, sawdust, and the ghost of 1,000 bait buckets. I watched Cobscook Bay through the passenger window silver in the late afternoon light, the tide pulling east, small chop breaking the surface. I used to read water the way Maggie read books. Not for what it said on the surface, but for what it meant underneath. Angus. Yeah, thank you. He nodded once. That was enough. We crossed into Lubeck at 4:40 p.m. I saw the lighthouse before I saw the house, the white brick tower rising above the spruce line. The lantern room catching the last angled light of April. The beacon was dark. It had been dark since Troy changed the locks, but the tower stood, the way it has stood since I laid the first course of salvaged brick in 1984. Angus parked in the gravel drive. The air hit me salt, pine, low-tide kelp, cold granite, and for the first time in months, I breathed without counting. The front door still had Troy's chrome lock. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the brass key ring from Maggie's safe deposit box. There was a second key on the ring I had not noticed before. Smaller, older, brass-worn smooth. Maggie had copied the original house key. She had placed it beside the bank key, knowing that someday I would need to come home and the door would not open for me. I slid the key into the lock. It turned. The door whispered open, the sound a house makes when it recognizes the person who built it. Troy's jacket was gone from the hook. Kristen's shoes were gone from the mat. But Maggie's reading chair sat in its corner by the window. The grandmother's quilt folded over the arm, untouched. I walked through every room, then out the back door, down the 212 steps to the lighthouse. The lighthouse door still had Troy's bright brass lock. But beneath the white paint he had applied, I could feel the grooves of Maggie's carving pressing through. Paint covers. It does not erase. I climbed the tower 107 steel spiral steps, entered the lantern room, and flipped the manual switch. The light came on. A white beam swept out across Cobscook Bay, 12 seconds per rotation, cutting through the gathering dusk. Not to wake. To confirm. I am here. I have always been here. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in May, I woke at 5:15 a.m., brewed black coffee, poured 2 mugs, and carried them to the porch. Maggie's mug sat on the right side of the railing, where it has sat every morning since 1984. I do not drink from it. When the coffee grows cold, I pour it into the garden, into the soil where her roses grow. Ada arrived at noon. She drove up from Bar Harbor with her camera bag and a box of blueberry scones. She did not call ahead. She simply appeared. The way light appears on the horizon gradually, then all at once. We sat on the porch. She looked at the lighthouse beam turning its slow 12-second circle and said, "Mom would be proud of you, Dad. She planned for this." I said, "All of it." Ada smiled. Maggie's smile, the one that starts at the corners and takes its time reaching the eyes. Clara called the following week. The trust had been disbursed $5 million, deposited at Machias First National Bank. Maggie had even prepaid Clara's legal retainer, buried on page 11 of the trust. Funds allocated for any legal defense necessary to preserve the property and its keeper. She had thought of everything. I donated $1 million to the Lubeck Memorial Library in Maggie's name. Ellen Park placed a brass plaque above the circulation desk. For Maggie, who believed every story deserved a proper ending, $500,000 went to the Coast Guard Foundation for rescue swimmer families. $1 million I set aside for Ada. She refused twice, so I deposited it the third time without telling her. The remaining $2.5 million became the Russell and Margaret Hale Lighthouse Preservation Fund, administered by Clara. To maintain the beacon for as long as the tower stands. Troy did not contact me. I did not contact Troy. Devlin surrendered his law license in June. Kristen filed for divorce in Portland. I do not know where my son lives now. I hope he remembers that some things cannot be taken, only given. On a Tuesday afternoon in late May, I stripped the white paint from the lighthouse door, heat gun and flat chisel. One layer at a time. 4 patient hours. When I finished, the carving was there, clean and deep, exactly as Maggie had cut it 44 years earlier. Russell and Margaret. 1983. As long as this light stands, we stand. I ran my fingers across the letters and spoke to her. Not out loud, in the quiet language that 40 years of marriage builds, the language of coffee on the railing, of hands touching in the dark, of a 12-second beam sweeping out across the water and coming back, always coming back. The light stands, Maggie. We stand.